Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. And today I'm talking about the 2006 horror remake, The Wicker Man. In The Wicker Man, Nicolas Cage plays a police officer that receives a letter from his ex-fiancée telling him that her daughter has gone missing on a small island. Nick Cage arrives there, and while conducting an investigation into the girl's disappearance, he finds himself in the middle of a strange matriarchal, pagan, bee-centric community, and hijinks ensue. So a lot has been said about this movie, so I thought I'd do things slightly differently and do a bit of a dive into the world of The Wicker Man first. So before we start talking about this flaming hot mess of a movie, let's peel back a few layers to find out how it got burned.
How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned? How'd it get burned?
I don't know!
By the way, heads up in advance for spoilers on both Wicker Man films. So let's begin in 1967. The year Ritual by David Pinner was published, which is the novel that the 1973 Wicker Man was loosely based on. The novel originally started as a screenplay that David Pinner was writing for Michael Winner to direct. Winner ended up dropping out, so Pinner turned it into a book. And you can definitely see the bones of the 1973 Wicker Man when you read Ritual. It's about a Puritan inspector who's investigating a mystery involving a young girl, and it's set in a village full of strange locals that practice occult rituals, and the story is set a few days before the big festival. Also, one of the suspects works in a sweet shop. And both stories involve the inspector stumbling across an orgy at one point. And there's a character in the book called Anna who's clearly the direct inspiration to Britt Ekland's character Willow from the movie. They're both very sexually promiscuous young ladies, and they both have a moment where they strip naked and try to entice the protagonist from the other side of the wall. Except in the book, during that part, the inspector starts licking the wallpaper out of horniness, and Edward Woodward doesn't quite go that far. But that's about where the similarities end between Ritual and the 1973 Wicker Man. They are very different stories. Like I said, it's a loose adaptation. Firstly, it's set in Cornwall instead of an island off of Scotland. I do think you lose some of the tension when your protagonist can just get on a train or drive away. Another big difference is that in the book he's tipped off to there being some sort of pagan ritual involved even before he arrives. I think he specifically takes the case because there's garlic placed by the dead body, which suggests some sort of pagan shenanigans, instead of the movie where that stuff is slowly revealed. And also in Ritual, it's actually a real death that he's investigating as opposed to a fake disappearance. The protagonist of Ritual is also a lot less likable than Sergeant Howie from The Wicker Man. He's a self-righteous, holier-than-thou Puritan with a self-professed Oliver Cromwell complex, and he actually makes Howie seem pretty chill in comparison, if you can believe that. At one point he grabs a little girl by the throat for taking his sunglasses, and he pulls a woman by the hair and whips her with his suspenders, and he's not doing that in a fun, kinky, consensual way. He's also extremely dismissive of the Cornish villagers to an offensive degree, claiming that he can smell incest. And on the topic of the problematic, there's a character called who's described as having these features, and as a whole, the writing in this book is not stellar. There's a lot of flowery, overwritten passages that are just a chore to get through. And there's also a few baffling ChatGPT level lines where you go, who the hell wrote this? In her first year, she went through the men like an enema. That's a beautiful metaphor, isn't it? She had sex with a lot of men, just like that thing that you shove up your ass to make you shit. Or how about this? The nipples lick the edge of the waistcoat like dwarfs' tongues. Actually, this book is wall to wall with nipple talk. Woman purses her nipples. Later, she flexes her favorite breast against the wall, whatever the hell that means. The author can't even describe the sea without describing the surging nipples of a character that's not even there. I will admit, though, that the central mystery of the novel is quite gripping at times. I think largely due to the colorful side characters. There's a gang of kids whose leader is called Fat Billy. You've got the local witch, the flute-playing squire, the cross-dressing actor with an interest in satanic rites, and of course the nymphomaniac girl with the rippling nipples. In a way, it reminded me a bit of Twin Peaks, the big city detective investigating the death of a girl in a town full of kooky weirdos. So when I was reading it, I was like, okay, it's the book that inspired The Wicker Man. We all know how it's gonna end. It's gonna turn out that the inspector's been lured here to be sacrificed as part of a pagan ritual. But spoiler alert, that is not what happens whatsoever in this book. So during the inspector's investigation into the young girl's death, more bodies begin to turn up. Fat Billy and This guy. Scotland Yard eventually arrives and the reader still doesn't know who's been doing the murders. And then the inspector kisses Anna, who's been lusting over him the whole book. And then there's a bit of a time jump where the nurse is bandaging up the inspector. And he says how weird it was that he blacked out while kissing Anna. And then when he came to, he saw that she had his knife in her head and he wonders who the killer was. And the boss says not to worry, the children saw a schizophrenic man murder her. And then it's revealed that he's inside a white room. The end. What the hell kind of ending is that? I think my initial notes sum it up when I wrote WTF ending. So there's no Wicker Man or any ritualistic sacrifice. My understanding is that the girl at the very start wasn't murdered, she just died from falling out a tree. And I guess the inspector just went crazy and did all the other murders. I suppose I can say that I didn't see the ending coming. And to the book's credit, there is a bit of foreshadowing. The guy does exhibit some majorly erratic behavior. There's that part I talked about earlier where he chokes the little girl, which happens when his sunglasses are removed and he begins to black out, which appears to be what happened with Anna at the end. But I just kind of brushed off the blacking out because they already established that he has sunlight sensitivity. And earlier than that, Anna does warn him that something's happening to him that happens to everyone who comes here because of something unreal, which will make him lose his reason and will. And her mother also quite calmly predicts that he will go mad. And also at the very end there's something said about sun madness. So in the end I guess it was more of a Shining scenario, where the stress of the job and the possible presence of the supernatural drives a man to madness. Maybe, who the hell even knows? Well, I guess screenwriter Anthony Shaffer and legendary actor Christopher Lee saw some potential in the novel and purchased the rights. Anthony Shaffer and the director Robin Hardy wanted to move away from the typical Hammer horror movies with all their tropes, and instead they wanted to make a film about the old religion and the nature of sacrifice. And Anthony Shaffer soon discovered that a direct adaptation of the book would not work. So like I said, he came up with a story only loosely based on the novel. And from there, the 1973 cult classic The Wicker Man was born, which Cinema Fantastique once described as the Citizen Kane of horror movies. Although the director and the screenwriter and the actors of the film have argued that it's not really a horror movie. I mean, yeah, nothing overtly horror-ish happens until about 80% of the way through, but there is a lingering, unsettling presence throughout. And I think any movie where the hero is burned alive in a pagan sacrifice at the end is a horror movie. But to me, the big draw of the 1973 Wicker Man is the whole vibe it puts out. I think they strike the delicate balance between whimsical and grounded perfectly, and I'll talk about that more later with the remake. But I think one of the things that made this film so atmospheric is the use of music. And I don't just mean the songs that play in the background, like the one that goes corn rigs and barley rigs and corn rigs.
Corn rigs and barley rigs and corn rigs are bonny.
I'm talking about the diegetic songs that play within the context of the story. It did surprise me how many musical numbers there were in this movie. There's a great part where Sergeant Howie is in a pub, and he gets introduced to the landlord's daughter, and then all the locals immediately jump into an impromptu little ditty about her.
Much has been said of the strumpets of yore,
Of wenches and baldy house queens by the score. But I sing of the baggage that we all adore. The landlord's daughter.
And they even allude to her vagina, but her and her dad don't seem to mind.
Nothing can delight so
As does the part that lies between
her left toe.
and her right toe.
Upon rewatch, I think they're singing this sexually suggestive song to get a gauge as to whether this newcomer is pure and virginal and fit for the sacrifice. But I would legitimately love to walk into a pub where they broke into song like that. But I think the best use of music in the film is the scene that I said was inspired by the book, where the landlord's daughter Willow is trying to seduce the inspector from the other side of the wall. But in the film she sings a song and it's a hauntingly beautiful siren song. There's something hypnotic about it. But as whimsical as some of that stuff is, the ending of the movie still hits like a ton of bricks. The jaunty singing of the villagers is juxtaposed with Edward Woodward singing "The Lord is my shepherd" in the face of his impending immolation. It's truly disturbing. Apparently the film company's advertising executives were appalled by the movie's ending, suggesting a sudden rainstorm that would douse the Wicker Man's flames and save Sergeant Howie's life. And thank God they didn't listen to that, because I think as good as the film is, if they sugarcoated the ending, it wouldn't be the classic that it is. It really is a deeply harrowing, unforgettable gut punch of an ending. And that leads me to a big question that I have. Why remake a movie with such a shock value iconic ending? I mean, even before I watched the original Wicker Man, I was aware of how it ended. It's been referenced in other media, and even look at this poster. Flesh to burn, don't keep the Wicker Man waiting. So remaking it is a bit like remaking The Sixth Sense. Everybody knows how it ends. But I've been thinking about the optimal way to remake the Wicker Man. And I came to the conclusion that there's two routes you can take when making a homage to the Wicker Man. Firstly, you can try to do it in a way where the audience doesn't realize that they're watching a movie about a secret cult until the end. I can actually think of something I watched once where the big secret twist reveal was an elaborate homage to the Wicker Man. But the problem is I don't want to tell you what that is because I don't want to ruin the twist. So I'm just going to tell you that it was in the episode of Inside Number 9, which is an anthology show that I highly recommend you watch anyway. So ideally, you just start watching that show, and when you get to the Wicker Man one, you go, oh shit, that must have been what that guy on YouTube was talking about. But the other approach to doing a Wicker Man is to redo the basic plot of the Wicker Man, but instead of a focus on Christianity versus the old religion, give it a different central theme. A good example of that is the film Midsommar. A lot of people have criticized that film for being too derivative of the Wicker Man, and honestly, I felt a little bit like that the first time I watched it too. And oh yeah, spoiler warning for Midsommar. But when you boil it down, Midsommar is essentially a Wicker Man scenario, right? A group of people get lured by a society that practices pagan rituals, and most of them get sacrificed at the end. But what I like about Midsommar is that Ari Aster mainly just uses that as a jumping off point to tell his own story about a girl dealing with grief. Florence Pugh's character is deeply depressed and vulnerable throughout, but she gets embraced by this pagan community, and as a result of her boyfriend getting sacrificed at the end, she finally turns that Florence Pugh frown upside down and smiles. At long last, she feels a sense of relief and acceptance, and all it took was for her to get indoctrinated into a cult of manipulative murderers. That's undeniably a very different arc from the one in the 1973 movie. So what approach did they take in the 2006 remake? Well, in some ways the story is quite faithful to the original as far as the story beats they cover. They're both about a policeman that's investigating the disappearance of a young girl, and he travels by plane to a mysterious island. In the remake they added a S and called it Summer's Isle for some reason, and during the investigation he shows a photo of the girl to the locals who deny knowledge of her. He learns about their annual celebrations through the framed photographs on the wall, and one of them is missing. Then he interrupts a school lesson where children are being taught about phallic symbols.
All right then, anybody.
Phallic symbol. Phallic symbol, phallic symbol.
He's told that the girl he's looking for is dead, and when he attempts to leave he can't get away because his plane's been sabotaged. He sees some weird behavior from the locals, like a girl in the closet pretending to be dead, so he puts on a costume to sneak into the celebration until he realizes that it's all been a charade, and he's eventually sacrificed by being burned alive in a Wicker Man. A clear attempt was made to replicate the original. I mean, the dialogue is almost word for word the same at times.
Where is the rotting body of Rowan Morrison?
Why, where you'd expect it to be, in the earth.
You mean in the churchyard?
Where's her body?
Exactly where you would expect it to be, in the earth.
In a churchyard.
There's even a little Easter egg to the original in that Nicolas Cage's character's first name is Edward, and his ex-wife's character's surname is Woodward, which is obviously an homage to the actor from the original movie, Christopher Lee. Nah, I'm just kidding. So why does one movie have a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes and the other one has a 15? Well, remember when I said that if you're gonna do The Wicker Man, I think you need to pick a different central theme like Midsommar did. And there's definitely an attempt at that in the remake. Instead of being about a clash of religions, it's more about the divide between men and women. As the director and the writer of the remake, Neil LaBute, said, "We can't exactly do the same religious idea here. So I threw out this notion of this matriarchal society in this sort of honeycomb of a plot." He also said, "It's an island of women and Nicolas Cage. That sounds like an evenly matched game to me." Honestly, that last quote kind of made me laugh because it's the kind of stupid shit that I usually say on this channel. But Neil LaBute's Summer's Isle Island in the remake is a female-led society, where the men are subservient, and they explain that it was formed by Lady Summersisle's Celtic ancestors, who vowed never to return to the ways of the female suppression of the 17th century, and later the Salem witch trials. The village also has a fixation on bees. And I understand the metaphor there. Bees have a female leader, the queen. The men are the drones whose purpose is breeding. And the hive must be protected at all costs. On paper, that's not a bad concept, but the problem is that that's about as far as the theme goes in this movie. I'm not familiar with Neil LaBute's other work, but I did a quick read of the wiki page for his film In the Company of Men, which seems to make an attempt at deconstructing misogyny and sexism, so I guess that's his area of interest. But in the Wicker Man remake, that stuff just feels kind of half-baked and muddled. What made the religious theme in the original work was the conflict of these core beliefs. Sergeant Howie wasn't a religious extremist, but he definitely had some strong fundamental ideas that he believed in, which were at direct odds with the beliefs of the other villagers. But Nicolas Cage's character in the remake doesn't really have an investment in men's rights activism, or really anything like that, and he's also not particularly misogynistic. He tries to save a woman and her daughter at the start, and he seemingly treated his ex-fiancée respectfully. There's a couple of moments that lend itself to the idea that he's a bit misogynistic, I guess. He calls a woman bar maiden, and I suppose a feminist reading of the film might suggest that his badge is an extension of its phallic symbol, because he's constantly whipping that out loud in front of the women, and also his gun, I guess. But he's mostly relatively respectful to the women, all things considered. He does exhibit violence towards the women, but only once he uncovers evidence of murder. And he uses the sexist slur bitch towards them.
You bitches!
But it's only when he's about to get his legs broken. I mean, I completely respect women, but I think that's the one time you're allowed to call a woman a bitch. And I think by not really having him be in the wrong, it's like, what's the message then? That women are evil? I wonder if the remake would have worked better if the lead detective was this, like, toxic masculinity Andrew Tate type guy. But then again, if they did that, we all would have been counting down the seconds until he gets the bees poured on his head at the end, so maybe it was for the best. So I talked earlier about the debate that some people have about the original movie as to whether it should be considered horror, because the horror only happens at the end. But the remake tries to double down on the horror aspect throughout the runtime. But the problem is the way the movie attempts to remind you that it's a horror film is through multiple hallucination stupid jump scares with a truck on a boat and weird PTSD black and white dream sequences that aren't at all scary, they're just annoying. The most egregious example of this is the scene where Nick Cage sees the missing girl underwater, and he tries to save her but it was just a dream, and then he's holding the girl's dead body, but that's also just a dream. I hate stuff like that in movies. I know it's meant to be a manifestation of his guilt and trauma, but it's just cheap and lazy. The original didn't have to resort to stuff like that. Here's a good example of the ways the two different Wicker Man films try to approach creepiness. In the original, Howie opens a desk and there's a beetle tied to a string, and it's this weird little moment.
The little old beetle goes round and round, always the same way you see, until it ends up right up tight to the nail.
In the remake, Nick Cage opens a desk and there's a jump scare as a bird flies out. The original didn't have to resort to loud noises, and the contents of the desk was still able to convey the same symbolic image of entrapment, which also parallels the predicament of the protagonist. Despite all his rage, he's still just a beetle in a desk. But in the remake, it's just, there's a crow. And even with the jump scares, I think the pacing is way worse in the remake. It takes about 15 minutes to even get to Summer's Isle in the remake, but only about 5 minutes in the original. I'm aware that a lot of cuts were made to the original, and I think originally there was a longer prologue that's been lost now, but pacing-wise, maybe it was better that way. I like that they get straight to it. And I get that in the remake they have this prologue to set up the character, but I don't think any of that nonsense about the car accident at the start really pays off enough to justify it being there. And it's not just the first 15 minutes that are slow, a lot of this movie drags. Kate Behan gives a really flat and boring performance in this movie. I know that canonically her character is lying and acting weird to keep up the ruse, but most of her scenes are a goddamn snooze fest. Wait a second, what's her name? Kate Behan? Behan! The bees! I'm only messing around, I'm sure it's a coincidence. I know none of the other actresses have B in their name. You've got Ellen Burstyn, who was in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and The Exorcist, and Queen Bees! Oh my god, I've stumbled across something here. Sorry, I think I'm starting to get that sun madness that the guy from the book had. But even though Ellen Burstyn is decent in the role as Sister Summerisle, she's certainly no Christopher Lee in this. His grandiose performance as Lord Summerisle was an integral part of what made the original great. And also Sister Summerisle doesn't even show up until over an hour of the way in. I think you need a recurring foil for the protagonist throughout the movie. I think the movie might have tried to divide that role up into Sister Beach and Sister Rose, but it doesn't really work. But let's face it, I know why you're here. You didn't click on a video about the Wicker Man with a guy with a bear hat to listen to him talk about a book from the 1960s, or to hear me evaluate the feminist message of the film. You're here to watch me talk about the memes and the screams and the bears and the bees. The movie certainly has a so bad it's good reputation. Nicolas Cage and Neil LaBute have both stated that this movie is meant to be intentionally funny. Cage said that he wanted to go even further with the goofiness and have his character have a handlebar mustache, which would have been amazing, and he also said that he wanted his character to still be in the costume when he was burned alive at the end. And Midsommar ended up doing exactly that, which is kind of interesting. And Neil LaBute said that the original movie makes you giggle, but the ending is completely sobering, and that's the tone they were going for. And a lot of people have called that a cope, and compared it to Tommy Wiseau saying that The Room was meant to be a dark comedy all along. But I actually think Neil LaBute has a good point about the original. There is a lot of weird and silly stuff in that movie. I've already mentioned the songs, and actually I think it was a big mistake for the remake to ditch the songs, especially if they were going for the same vibe as the original. Like, imagine Nicolas Cage's character walking in and all the women are singing a song about bees and he's just standing there awkwardly. But in the original, you've got stuff like Christopher Lee quoting Walt Whitman while looking at two snails mating. And later he's prancing along in a purple dress, white makeup, and a wig. I can see people giggling at that. And when you think about it, The Wicker Man is essentially the story of a man who's at the receiving end of an elaborate practical joke. That does somewhat lend itself to a comedic tone. There's even a part in the original where Edward Woodward dresses up as a literal fool, and he punches someone while dressed as Punch. This is obviously the inspiration to the scene where Nick Cage disguises himself as a bear and punches a woman. It is interesting that the Nick Cage version of that is seen as a laugh riot, but nobody makes fun of that Edward Woodward scene, even though I think on paper dressing up as a fool is more humiliating than dressing up as a bear. But I know the reason why the version where Nicolas Cage is dressed up as a bear is funnier. Because it's Nicolas Cage dressed up as a bear, there's an inherent humor to that. My favorite part of the whole bear sequence is the little run-up he does before the punch. But I do think that this movie is not as funny as everybody makes it out to be. Like I said earlier, I found a lot of it to be pretty slow. And I personally didn't find anything overtly comedic about it until the last 25 minutes or so. But in that last 25 minutes or so, there are moments of gold.
Step away from the bike.
There's a great little part where Nicolas Cage is walking down a hallway and he opens a door, and it's a deformed old naked man in bed. And he's like, alright, what's in this door? Oh, it's a woman with a beard of bees, yeah, sure. I wanted him to just keep on opening doors. What else is there? You half expect him to open another door and it's the guy from The Shining in the bear suit giving the guy a blowjob. And I've got to admit that I also did get a kick out of the parts where he was fighting the women. My personal favorite is where he silently walks up to Sister Beach and does this. Those parts actually remind me of the book more than the original. Like I said, the guy in the book was prone to violence. And maybe Nick Cage is going through that goddamn sun madness. But here's my hot take on this movie. Nicolas Cage's performance is not that bad. I think that there's legitimately a relatively natural progression to it. At the start he's very quiet and subdued to reflect the trauma that his character has been through, but he lightens up a bit once he gets to the island, and I do quite like the way he plays his character's naivety. He's initially just kind of bemused by everything.
What's in the bag? A shark or something?
Gradually, that perplexity turns into anger.
Rose, Sister Rose.
Of course. Another plant. Rose.
And in the last part of the movie, he does kind of devolve into insanity. But at that point, I think it's kind of been earned. I'll fully admit that the how to get burned part is scenery chewing at its finest, but I think his character's frustration is understandable. He's a man with a history of trauma that's being gaslit about what happened to his missing daughter. And he's just sick of the bullshit. I mean, how is he meant to act? So I think Cage does a fine job, all things considered. And of course, I'm obligated to talk about, the bees!
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah! Oh, my eyes! My eyes! Ah! Ah!
This is the most famous scene in the movie. If you say to somebody 2006 Wicker Man, they'll say, the bees, not in my eyes. It was even referenced in another Nicolas Cage movie.
He wanted me to wear a bee, and I said, Jeff, not the bees, not the bees.
But what's interesting is the scene where he says, the bees, isn't in most versions of the movie that are available. It wasn't in the theatrical cut, and it's only in the unrated version that's kind of hard to find. And the unrated version cuts out the original ending with Jane Franco and television's Jason Ritter. It's a dumb ending where it implies that Jane Franco and TV's Jason Ritter will be the next sacrifices. It's stupid, but on a meta level, I do kind of like the casting of Jane Franco as Cage's successor, because he was Nicolas Cage's surrogate when Nicolas Cage directed Sunny. But back to the scene with the bees. I will admit that it's fun. I love a good Nick Cage freakout, and I even like some of the memes that were born out of it. But again, as over the top as he is, if you were being stung by hundreds of bees after having your legs broken, I think, is a reasonable response. I mean, personally, I would try to keep my mouth shut if bees were being poured onto my face, but you know. And as much as I've defended Nicolas Cage's performance in this movie, it pales in comparison to Edward Woodward's performance from the original. Let's compare their delivery of similar lines to the villagers right before they're sacrificed.
Well, don't you see that killing me is not going to bring back your apples?
Edward Woodward retains quiet dignity in the face of adversity, his desperate reasoning falling on deaf ears. Now here's how Nick Cage does it.
Killing me won't bring back your goddamn honey!
One is clearly objectively better than the other, but I still like Nicolas Cage's performance. So overall, overall, this movie is bad, but not for the reasons most people will give you. It's not bad because of the over-the-top moments and Nicolas Cage acting crazy. I honestly think that this movie bored me and annoyed me more than it made me laugh. Now, this movie is bad because it's a remake of a classic film that helped pioneer the folk horror genre, but it fails to capture what made that movie special in almost every way. And the additions that they add bring nothing interesting to the table, outside of the casting of Nicolas Cage. That being said, the parts that are funny are funny. And over the years, people have got a lot of joy out of the memes that it spawned. And if you gave me a choice to live in a universe where there's a horror movie where Nicolas Cage dresses up as a bear, or live in a universe where the Wicker Man remake never got made, I would choose to live in the Nicolas Cage bear costume universe every time. I just think the movie kind of works best as a collection of funny clips on YouTube. So the next movie Nicolas Cage was in was Ghost Rider, so until next time guys, thanks for watching.